In 1971, the world's most powerful currency quietly lost its anchor. The United States closed the gold window, and with one signature, money became a promise without a weight. The markets cheered, but underneath the applause, something irreversible began. Every empire that controls its own currency believes it can defy gravity. It never can. From ancient Rome to modern Washington, the pattern is the same. Debt grows faster than wealth. Confidence outpaces production. And then, suddenly, the illusion collapses. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in stages. Some historians count 7. The first is prosperity, the era of trust. The last is reset, the moment when numbers lose meaning. Between them lies a sequence so precise it resembles an algorithm, and once a nation enters it, escape is almost impossible. The British Empire entered it after World War I. Japan did in the 1980s. The United States entered it in 2008 and never came out. Every crisis since has been a symptom, not a cause. The virus is the system itself. Imagine wealth as a pyramid of promises. At the top, paper claims. At the base, real assets, land, energy, labor. When the base shrinks and the paper keeps multiplying, the pyramid tilts. It looks stable until it isn't. Stage 5 is when the tilt becomes visible to everyone. That's where we are now. Some say it's just a cycle. Others call it a correction. But the data shows something else, a mathematical inevitability playing out in slow motion. In every previous epoch, 89% of private wealth vanished before the system rebooted. It wasn't stolen. It was repriced. And the repricing has already begun. You can see it in housing, in currency flows, in the rise of assets that produce nothing but hope. The world still believes it is creating wealth. In reality, it's redistributing the remnants of the old. The coincidence is too precise to be accidental. Every signal matches the 5th stage of decay in historic wealth cycles. Debt is the new gold, inflation the new tax, and confidence the last commodity left. If this opened another side of history for you, comment where you're watching from. The story begins long before the first dollar was printed, long before Wall Street existed. It begins with a simple idea, that wealth can be stored in symbols, not in things. That idea made civilizations rise and collapse for more than 5,000 years. In ancient Mesopotamia, grain was the first currency. It represented labor, growth, and survival. When storage houses began issuing clay tokens as proof of ownership, the first paper money was born. People stopped counting wheat. They counted symbols. And from that moment, power shifted from those who produced to those who issued. Fast forward to the 20th century. The symbols changed shape, but not meaning. Gold, once the universal anchor, became inconvenient. It limited the ambitions of governments and bankers. After 2 world wars, the world was drowning in debt and needed something elastic. So in 1944, 44 nations gathered in a small town called Bretton Woods. They signed an agreement that made the US dollar the center of the world's economy, but tied it to gold at $35 an ounce. In theory, that was stability. In practice, it was the beginning of control. For 2 decades, the system appeared flawless. The United States produced half the world's goods, held most of its gold, and defined its credit. Europe rebuilt. Asia industrialized. It was a golden illusion, wealth growing faster than effort. But underneath, the same imbalance appeared again. More dollars were printed than there was gold to redeem them. The pyramid was rising, but its base stayed the same. By the late 1960s, foreign governments began to ask for gold instead of paper. France demanded hundreds of tons back from American vaults. Britain followed. The numbers no longer matched the metal. Confidence, that invisible foundation of modern economies, began to crack. And when Nixon temporarily closed the gold window in 1971, it was not a technical adjustment. It was the declaration of a new era. Money without anchor, wealth without weight. From that moment, every dollar was backed not by gold, but by trust. And trust, unlike gold, can be manufactured in infinite quantity. Governments discovered they could spend more than they earned. Banks discovered they could lend more than they held. Households discovered they could live better than they produced. The system rewarded illusion and punished discipline. Some economists warned it couldn't last, but the results looked too good to question. GDP rose, credit expanded, markets became religion. The world mistook liquidity for prosperity. The invisible battery of debt was charging, quietly, constantly. Each year more current, each crisis more voltage. And while most nations played along, a new architecture of dependence took shape. Energy, trade, and finance all tied to the dollar. Every commodity priced through a single lens. Every transaction feeding the same center. The global economy became a web, strong on the surface, fragile underneath. The illusion was elegant. It made the 20th century look like the triumph of capitalism. But in reality, it was the triumph of leverage. Real growth slowed. Paper growth accelerated. And those who understood the pattern saw the early stages forming, the same sequence that had erased fortunes many times before. What appeared to be progress was, in fact, the perfect setup for the next decline. Because once money loses its weight, the entire measure of wealth becomes negotiable. If this gave you a clearer view of how the system began, comment where you're watching from. By the late 1970s, the new monetary order was already showing its cracks. The dollar was free but unstable. Inflation in the United States hit double digits. The more money was printed to sustain growth, the less value each unit carried. It was a paradox, prosperity that consumed itself. Central banks faced a dilemma. They could raise interest rates and trigger recession, or keep printing and destroy trust. Most chose the middle, a balance between illusion and pain. But balance never lasts long. It tilts, then breaks. In 1981, Paul Volcker, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, raised interest rates to nearly 20%. It was financial shock therapy. Factories closed, mortgages defaulted, yet inflation finally slowed. For a brief moment, the system breathed again. But the cure had a hidden cost. Debt became the only way to sustain demand. Governments, corporations, and households all learned the same habit. Borrow today, refinance tomorrow. The 1980s turned this habit into ideology. Financial innovation became the euphemism for multiplying claims on the same assets. Derivatives, futures, credit instruments, abstractions stacked on abstractions. Each layer created profits, not production. By 1987, the illusion of infinite wealth was back, this time under a new banner: the market always wins. Then came the crash. October 19, 1987. In a single day, the Dow Jones lost 22%. Panic swept the trading floors. Computers had replaced men. Algorithms replaced judgment. But within months, everything recovered. Not because productivity rose, but because liquidity flooded back in. The Fed had discovered its ultimate weapon: intervention. Whenever confidence fell, they printed it back. The pattern was set. Every crisis became a rehearsal for the next. The savings and loan collapse in 1989, the Asian financial storm in 1997, the dot-com implosion in 2000. Each time the same ritual: debt expansion, bailout, optimism. Each time the base of the pyramid grew thinner. And then came 2008, the year the illusion met arithmetic. Mortgage-backed securities, debts packaged as assets, exploded across global balance sheets. When housing prices stalled, the entire chain reaction reversed. Banks collapsed, markets froze, trust evaporated. It was the perfect example of a wealth cycle reaching its midpoint, the fifth stage beginning. Some believed it was an accident of greed, but the data told a colder truth. From 1980 to 2007, global debt had grown faster than income every single year. It wasn't a flaw, it was the model. The system had evolved to depend on expansion. Without it, it couldn't survive. When central banks rescued the markets in 2008, they didn't solve the problem. They institutionalized it. By printing trillions, they stabilized the surface, and destroyed the foundation. Interest rates fell to zero. Risk vanished as a concept. And money, that ancient measure of value, became a policy instrument. From that point forward, wealth was not created, it was engineered. Numbers replaced meaning. The cycle had crossed from organic growth to artificial extension. Stage 5 had begun, the phase where confidence replaces reality. The collapse of 2008 was not the end of an era. It was the end of belief that eras end naturally. If this helped you see the logic behind every unexpected crisis, tell me where you're watching from. To understand how wealth disappears, one must first understand how it multiplies. The mechanism isn't mysterious, it's mechanical. Money, credit, and confidence form a closed loop. When one expands unnaturally, the others must adjust. If they don't, imbalance becomes destiny. After 2008, the adjustment never came. Instead, central banks decided to rewrite the laws of finance. They called it quantitative easing, a polite phrase for creating trillions out of nothing. It wasn't printing in the old sense. It was digital, silent, clean, limitless. They bought bonds, mortgages, and even corporate debt, injecting liquidity directly into the bloodstream of markets. The goal? Restore trust. The result? Inflate everything. Here's how it worked. When a central bank buys bonds, it raises their price. When bond prices rise, yields fall. When yields fall, investors flee to riskier assets, stocks, real estate, speculative funds. Prices soar even when production stagnates. The system rewards risk, not effort. Capital flows upward, wages stagnate below. And suddenly, 1% of the population controls more than half of all financial assets. It wasn't corruption, it was geometry. Every dollar created through credit has to be owed by someone. Every interest payment has to be extracted from the real economy. Debt is an invisible siphon, pulling future income into present consumption. But once rates hit zero, the siphon reversed. Future wealth was exhausted, only new promises remained. Governments, facing stagnation, joined the game. Deficits grew, stimulus packages became annual rituals. The state became the market's insurer. Risk was privatized in profits and socialized in losses. Every bailout reinforced the illusion that nothing could fall. Every rescue created a larger bubble. Between 2008 and 2020, global debt tripled. Corporate borrowing outpaced productivity by 5 to 1. Housing prices detached from income by entire generations. An economy that once produced goods began producing valuations. The numbers rose, but meaning drained away. And then, in 2020, the final catalyst arrived. The pandemic froze real activity, yet markets hit record highs. Central banks printed the equivalent of 10 years of growth in a single year. It was the purest expression of Stage 5, when the monetary system stops measuring value and begins manufacturing it. Some economists called it the triumph of monetary policy. Others, quietly, called it the endgame. Because once interest, debt, and currency all converge towards zero, the system runs out of variables. The only thing left to manipulate is belief. That's why modern wealth doesn't vanish with war or famine anymore. It vanishes through repricing, silent, statistical, invisible. Inflation erodes savings, bubbles consume pensions, currencies dilute purchasing power. The losses are distributed slowly, like a tax on time. And by the time the public notices, 89% of real value has shifted upward or evaporated entirely. Some historians compare it to alchemy, turning paper into power, promises into assets, and trust into collateral. But alchemy always ends the same way. The furnace runs cold and gold becomes smoke. If this revealed how illusion turns into arithmetic, comment where you're watching from. When the base of wealth becomes belief, the collapse never begins with panic. It begins with fatigue, a silent exhaustion of value. Numbers still rise, but their meaning fades, like ink dissolving in water. By 2021, markets looked invincible. Indexes hit records, luxury sales soared, and governments called it recovery. But beneath the graphs, something fundamental was breaking. Real wages stalled, supply chains fractured, savings lost power. The cost of living rose faster than any official index admitted. It wasn't inflation of prices. It was deflation of trust. Central banks had no way back. Raising rates would detonate the debt pyramid. Keeping them low would destroy currencies. They chose both. First denial, then desperation. By 2022, the phrase transitory inflation had become a confession of blindness. And when the adjustment finally came, it was violent. Bond markets, once the safe haven of civilization, collapsed. In a single year, global bonds lost over $30 trillion in value. That number didn't appear in headlines, but it was the largest destruction of paper wealth in human history. Pension funds, insurers, governments, all marked down silently. Households saw it only as higher rent, shrinking savings, or a mortgage suddenly impossible. Meanwhile, the digital frontier turned into a battlefield. Crypto empires vanished overnight. Once worth billions, they were revealed as reflections of the same faith-based system, only faster. NFTs, tokens, meme stocks, each one a fragment of belief detached from production. When belief cracked, they turned to dust. Energy prices surged, food followed, and the cost of capital, that ancient price of time, returned with a vengeance. Economies slowed, but debt payments didn't. Governments borrowed more to hide the symptoms, repeating the ritual that caused them. Every solution injected another dose of instability. And for the middle class, the supposed backbone of prosperity, the effect was slow strangulation. Their savings eroded, assets inflated beyond reach, and their wages failed to catch the curve. They didn't lose their wealth overnight. They lost their future, one interest rate at a time. This is how Stage 5 dissolves into Stage 6, when people begin to suspect the rules have changed. They still play, but no longer believe they can win. Consumption slows, investment hesitates, and the system feeds on its own inertia. Capital flees to safety, safety disappears, and what remains is accounting smoke, numbers with no narrative. In this silence, power reorders itself. Governments absorb industries, corporations become policy arms, and markets turn into management tools. Democracy itself bends to liquidity. History calls this consolidation. Economists call it stability. But in truth, it's the same phase every empire reached before its currency reset, from Rome's denarius to Britain's pound. The visible world continues to function. Flights depart, screens glow, salaries arrive. Yet behind it, the mechanism has reversed polarity. Wealth no longer accumulates, it evaporates upward, and the only constant left is debt, expanding like a tide that never recedes. Every civilization believes it is the exception. None ever were. If this made you look at stability differently, tell me where you're watching from. Look around. The script hasn't changed, only the actors have. Then it was gold and paper. Now it's data and code. Then the promise was convertibility. Now it's liquidity. Different vocabulary, same mechanism. In 1929, people lined up at banks. In 2023, they line up on screens. The sell order moves faster than thought. Confidence disappears in microseconds. The system still runs on belief, but now belief has a refresh rate. When central banks flooded the world with digital money, they didn't just rescue markets. They rewrote the architecture of trust. Every balance, every transaction, every piece of value now depends on algorithms most people will never see. We moved from gold to code without realizing we'd crossed the final threshold, from tangible scarcity to programmable abundance. And with that, the economy became something new, a managed illusion that behaves like reality until it doesn't. Take growth. Today it's measured in transactions, not production. A company can lose money for 10 years and still be called successful, as long as the story expands. In the old world, cash flow was proof of life. In the new one, narrative is currency. That's not innovation. That's substitution. The same logic repeats at every level. Governments fight inflation by creating more debt. Banks ensure solvency by creating synthetic capital. Consumers chase freedom through credit. Every mechanism designed to protect wealth now consumes it instead. Technology made it invisible. Apps, platforms, and exchanges turned finance into entertainment. But every like, every swipe, every trade still feeds the same pyramid. Paper promises floating above a shrinking base of real value. Even artificial intelligence, the newest miracle, already follows the pattern. Billions flow into models that produce no goods, only expectations. A bubble made of prediction. Meanwhile, the illusion of stability deepens. Currencies digitize. Governments experiment with central bank digital currencies, programmable money that can expire, restrict, or direct spending. For the first time in history, control and currency merge. It's presented as efficiency, but it's the same old trade: freedom for safety, autonomy for access. Some call it modernization, but from a historical view, it's repetition. Rome debased its coins, Britain debased its credit, we debase our data. The principle is unchanged. Extend the lifespan of a system by diluting the meaning of its money. What happens next follows a script as old as civilization. When confidence becomes policy, policy becomes the economy. And when that economy can no longer explain itself, it resets, not by decision, but by necessity. Not because of morality, but mathematics. And now imagine, we are already living inside that equation. Every rise in interest rates, every liquidity injection, every headline about soft landings is a sign of the same stage: denial before realization. We are not watching history repeat. We are participating in its symmetry, because what we call modern finance is simply the antique cycle running on electricity. If this drew a mirror between past and present for you, tell me where you're watching from. Every collapse feels unique when you live inside it. The details change, technologies, currencies, names, but the rhythm never does. Expansion, euphoria, denial, correction, and then renewal. Each generation believes it's witnessing innovation. In truth, it's witnessing translation of the same story into a new language. We call it the economy, but at its core, it's a system of collective faith, a belief that tomorrow will honor today's promises. When that belief erodes, wealth doesn't vanish. It changes owners, forms, dimensions. What looks like destruction is often migration, from visible to invisible, from people to institutions, from paper to data. Some historians will describe this age as transition, others as reckoning. Both will be right, because every wealth cycle ends not in ruin, but in redefinition. What dies is the old meaning of value. What rises is a new one, smaller, colder, more efficient. The real danger isn't loss, but acceptance. When people stop asking what money is and start believing it simply exists, that's when the loop closes. And history waits, patiently, for the next generation to believe again. The seventh stage isn't the end. It's the silence before the next illusion begins. If this gave you a new lens on the cycle we're living through, tell me where you're watching from.